Gunfire split the night air as Margaret Kennedy crouched in the corner of the old barn, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. Through the cracks in the weathered wood, she could see the orange glow of flames beginning to lick at the structure. The smoke was already seeping in, stinging her eyes and burning her lungs. She pulled her torn skirt over her mouth and nose, desperate to filter the thickening air. How had a simple journey west turned into this nightmare, trapped alone with death approaching from all sides? Margaret had come to Colorado Territory in the spring of 1876, with dreams as vast as the western sky. At 22, she'd left behind the suffocating propriety of Boston society, determined to forge her own path. Her father's death had left her with enough inheritance to start anew, and the promise of land, independence, and possibility had drawn her west like so many others. What she hadn't counted on was becoming entangled in a deadly feud between cattle barons that would lead to her current predicament. Outside, she could hear men shouting. The Harrington gang, she was certain. They'd taken her captive that morning, mistaking her for Thomas Quinn's sister. Thomas Quinn, the neighboring rancher who'd shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival 3 months ago. The man whose friendship she'd come to treasure, whose smile made her feel things she hadn't expected to feel again after swearing off romance following a heartbreaking betrayal back east. "She'll burn if Quinn doesn't show," a gruff voice shouted outside the barn. "He's got till that roof catches to bring us the deed." Margaret fought back tears. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing her cry. Her wrists were raw from the rope that bound them, and the padlock on the barn door gleamed mockingly in the growing firelight. The Harringtons had started the blaze on the far side, giving her enough time to contemplate her fate while smoke gradually filled her lungs. She thought of Thomas, with his quiet strength and gentle eyes. Would he even know she was missing yet? They'd planned to meet tomorrow to discuss improvements to her small homestead. By then, she'd be nothing but ashes. A thunderous crack from above made her flinch. The fire was spreading faster than she'd thought possible. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to summon courage from somewhere deep within. She would not die cowering in fear. The sound of hoofbeats barely registered through the roar of the flames. When the barn door splintered open with a mighty crash, she thought it was just another portion of the structure giving way. But then, through the billowing smoke, came the silhouette of a man on horseback. "Margaret." The voice was deep, urgent, familiar. "Margaret, where are you?" "Thomas." Her voice came out as a rasp, her throat raw from smoke. "Here. I'm here." The massive chestnut stallion reared slightly as Thomas guided it through the doorway, navigating around fallen beams already consumed by fire. Margaret had never seen anything so terrifying or magnificent. Thomas's bandana was pulled up over his nose and mouth, his hat pulled low, but she'd recognize those piercing blue eyes anywhere. He dismounted in one fluid motion, rushing to her side and producing a knife from his belt to cut her bonds. "Can you stand?" His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Margaret nodded, though her legs felt like water as he helped her up. Above them, the roof groaned ominously. "We need to move. Now." Thomas half carried her toward his horse, the massive animal stomping nervously as embers rained down around them. A burning beam crashed just feet away, sending up a shower of sparks. Thomas shielded her with his body, his arm tight around her waist. "I'm going to lift you up," he shouted over the inferno's roar. "Hold tight to the saddle horn." With strength born of desperation, Thomas hoisted her onto the horse's back. She gripped the saddle with trembling hands as he swung up behind her, one arm wrapping securely around her waist while the other took the reins. "Hang on." The horse lunged forward through the doorway just as another section of the roof collapsed. Margaret pressed back against Thomas's solid chest, feeling the thundering of his heart matching the pounding hooves of his horse as they burst through a wall of smoke into the cool night air. Behind them, the barn was now fully engulfed, flames reaching skyward like the vengeful fingers of some ancient deity. In the distance, Margaret could see the retreating figures of the Harrington men, clearly not expecting their hostage to be rescued. Thomas didn't slow until they'd put considerable distance between themselves and the blazing structure. Finally, in a small clearing beside a creek, he drew the horse to a halt. His arms were still around her, his breathing ragged in her ear. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice hoarse from smoke and fear. "No," Margaret managed, though every breath sent daggers through her chest. "How did you know?" Thomas dismounted, then reached up to help her down. His hands lingered at her waist as he studied her face in the moonlight, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. "One of my ranch hands spotted the Harrington boys taking you from the mercantile. By the time word reached me, they'd already had you for hours." His jaw clenched. "I've been tracking them since midday." Margaret swayed slightly, the full weight of her ordeal suddenly pressing down upon her. Thomas steadied her, his touch gentle despite the calluses she could feel through the thin fabric of her blouse. "You could have been killed," she whispered, reaching up to touch his soot-stained cheek. "Riding in like that. And you would have been killed if I hadn't." His voice was matter-of-fact, but there was an underlying current that made her heart skip. There was no choice to make, Margaret. She looked up at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. Not just the handsome rancher who'd helped her learn the ways of the territory, but the man who'd just risked everything to save her life. "Thank you," she said simply, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt. Thomas nodded, then guided her to sit on a fallen log. He retrieved a canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. "Small sips," he instructed. "Your throat will be raw from the smoke." The water was cool and sweet, and Margaret hadn't realized how parched she was until that first swallow. As she drank, Thomas knelt before her, examining the rope burns on her wrists with gentle fingers. "We need to clean these," he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "And then we need to get you somewhere safe. The Harrington boys won't take kindly to having their plans disrupted." "Where will we go?" Margaret asked, suddenly realizing she couldn't return to her small homestead. "Not tonight, perhaps not ever." Thomas's eyes met hers, steady and sure. "My ranch. It's well defended and my men are loyal." "But that's what they want," Margaret protested. "They took me to draw you out, to force you to give them your land." A small, grim smile touched Thomas's lips. "Then they've made a grave miscalculation, because now I have even more reason to hold my ground." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. In that moment, with the distant glow of the burning barn at their backs and the vast, star-filled sky above, Margaret Kennedy realized that her life had irrevocably changed, and not just because she'd nearly lost it. As Thomas helped her onto his horse and mounted behind her, his strong arms once again encircling her protectively, she felt a curious sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. The danger wasn't past, it had, perhaps, only just begun, but for the first time since arriving in this wild territory, Margaret felt truly at home. "Hold tight," Thomas murmured close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "It's a long ride, but we'll make it together. Together." The words settled into her heart like a promise as they set off into the darkness, leaving the flames behind, but carrying their own newly kindled fire within. The journey to Thomas's ranch was arduous in the darkness, made more challenging by their need to avoid the main trails where Harrington's men might be waiting. Margaret's body ached from her ordeal, but she drew strength from Thomas's solid presence behind her. The rhythm of the horse's stride and the steady beat of Thomas's heart against her back became a kind of lullaby, nearly lulling her into exhaustion despite the circumstances. "Stay with me," Thomas said softly when her head lolled back against his shoulder. "We're almost there." "I'm awake," she murmured, though her eyelids felt leaden. "Just resting." His low chuckle rumbled through his chest. "Well, rest with your eyes open if you can. I need you alert in case we need to make a quick escape." That sharpened her senses. "Do you think we're being followed?" "I don't think so," Thomas replied, scanning the terrain around them. "But I've learned never to underestimate Harrington's determination, or his cruelty." Margaret shivered, remembering the cold eyes of Victor Harrington as he'd ordered his men to lock her in the barn. "Why does he hate you so much?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, as if carefully choosing his words. "Water rights, primarily. My land has the best access to the river that runs through this valley. Without it, his cattle suffer in the dry months. But it's more than that now. It's become personal. Because you wouldn't sell." "Because I wouldn't be intimidated," Thomas corrected. "In Harrington's world, power is everything. A man who won't bend becomes a threat to the very foundation of his existence." They crested a hill, and in the distance, Margaret could make out the sprawling silhouette of the Quinn ranch house and outbuildings. Lamplight glowed in several windows despite the late hour. As they approached, she could see men with rifles patrolling the perimeter. "Your people were expecting trouble," she observed. "They know what Harrington is capable of." Thomas guided his horse toward the main house. "And they're loyal to a fault." A tall, lanky man stepped forward as they approached the barn, rifle ready but lowered when he recognized Thomas. "Mr. Quinn, thank God." The relief in his voice was palpable. "We were about to organize a search party." "No need, Samuel," Thomas replied, dismounting before helping Margaret down. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, and he kept a supportive arm around her waist. "But we'll need to double the watch tonight. Miss Kennedy needs medical attention and rest." Samuel's eyes widened as he took in Margaret's disheveled appearance and the rope burns on her wrists. "Harrington's work," Thomas nodded grimly. "Have someone tend to Russet. He's earned his rest tonight." As Thomas led her toward the house, Margaret became acutely aware of her appearance, dress torn and smoke-stained, hair fallen from its pins, face smudged with soot. She'd never been to Thomas's home before, always meeting him in town or at her modest homestead. Now she was arriving like some bedraggled refugee. "I must look a fright," she murmured. Thomas glanced down at her, his expression softening. "You look like the bravest woman I've ever known." The simple sincerity in his voice warmed her more than any flattery could have. As they stepped onto the wide porch, the front door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a worried expression. "Martha," Thomas addressed the woman, "this is Miss Kennedy. She needs tending to." Martha's experienced gaze quickly assessed Margaret's condition. "Of course, Mr. Quinn. I'll draw a bath and find some clean clothes." She reached for Margaret's arm. "Come along, dear. You look about ready to collapse." Margaret hesitated, suddenly reluctant to leave Thomas's side. He seemed to understand, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're safe here," he promised. "Rest. We'll talk in the morning." Martha led Margaret through the spacious ranch house to a large bedroom on the second floor. Despite her exhaustion, Margaret couldn't help noticing the comfortable elegance of Thomas's home, the polished wood floors, the quality furniture, the small touches that spoke of refinement without ostentation. "Mr. Quinn built this place himself," Martha commented, noticing Margaret's interest as she poured steaming water into a copper tub set before the fireplace. "Started with just a one-room cabin 7 years ago. Built it up bit by bit, all proper and fine, as if he always knew someday it would need to be worthy of a lady's presence. Margaret felt her cheeks warm at the implication. "We're just neighbors," she said quickly. "Friends." Martha's knowing smile suggested she had her own opinions on the matter. "Friends worth riding into a burning building for are special friends indeed." She tested the water temperature with her wrist. "Now, let's get you out of these ruined clothes and into this bath before the water cools." The bath was heavenly, soothing Margaret's aching muscles and washing away the physical remnants of her ordeal. Martha treated her rope-burned wrists with a salve that smelled of herbs and beeswax, then helped her into a soft cotton nightgown. "It's one of mine," Martha explained, "so it might be a bit large, but it's clean and comfortable." "You're very kind," Margaret said, fighting to keep her eyes open as Martha guided her to the bed. "I don't want to impose." "Nonsense, Mr. Quinn would have my hide if I didn't take proper care of you." Martha tucked the quilt around her. "Rest now. There's a loaded Derringer in the bedside drawer if it helps you feel safer, though there's not a man on this ranch who wouldn't give his life to protect anyone under Mr. Quinn's care." As Martha quietly left the room, Margaret sank into the feather mattress, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Despite the lingering fear and uncertainty, she felt oddly at peace. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Thomas's eyes in the firelight, filled with a determination that made her believe, for the first time since her father's death, that she wasn't truly alone in the world. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through lace curtains. For a moment, Margaret was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-fogged mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: the kidnapping, the burning barn, Thomas's rescue. She sat up, wincing at the soreness in her muscles. Her wrists, though still tender, looked better than she'd expected thanks to Martha's ministrations. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Kennedy," Martha's voice called. "Are you awake?" "Yes, please come in." Martha entered carrying a tray and a bundle of clothing. "Brought you some breakfast and something to wear. Had a guess at your size, but these belonged to Mr. Quinn's sister when she visited last summer. She's about your build, I'd say." Margaret accepted the simple blue calico dress gratefully. "You've been so thoughtful. I can't thank you enough." "Think nothing of it." Martha set the breakfast tray on a small table by the window. "Mr. Quinn is anxious to see you're well. He's been up since before dawn organizing the men. Says he'll come speak with you when you're ready." After Martha left, Margaret ate the hearty breakfast of eggs, biscuits, and ham with surprising appetite. The borrowed dress fit reasonably well, though it was perhaps a bit loose in the waist and snug across the chest. She did her best with her hair using the brush and pins Martha had provided, managing to twist it into a simple but presentable style. When she finally ventured downstairs, she found Thomas in what appeared to be his study, bent over a large map spread across a desk. He looked up at her entrance, his expression immediately softening from intense concentration to relief. "Margaret." He crossed the room in long strides. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you." She was suddenly very aware of his height as he stood before her, his broad shoulders blocking the morning light from the window. "Your housekeeper has been extraordinarily kind. Martha's been with me since I first staked my claim here, more family than employee." He gestured to a comfortable chair near the fireplace. "Please sit. We need to talk about what happens next." Margaret settled into the chair, smoothing the unfamiliar skirt over her knees. "I suppose I should return to my homestead as soon as possible. I've already imposed enough." Thomas's expression turned grave as he took the seat opposite her. "I'm afraid that's not safe. Not yet. My men rode out at first light to check on your place." He hesitated, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten with dread. "What did they find?" Your cabin is still standing, but it's been ransacked. They left a message, Margaret. His jaw tightened. Painted on your wall, Quinn's woman dies next. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. But I'm not, we aren't. It doesn't matter what's true, Thomas said, leaning forward earnestly. Harrington has decided you're my weakness, and he'll use that belief against both of us. This is my fault, Margaret whispered. If I hadn't come here, no. Thomas's voice was firm. This conflict with Harrington was brewing long before you arrived. If anything, I've brought this danger to your doorstep, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. Margaret stared at her bandaged wrists, emotions warring within her. Fear, certainly, but also a growing anger. What do they hope to accomplish? Surely they don't think terrorizing a woman will make you surrender your land. A grim smile touched Thomas's lips. You don't know Victor Harrington. He believes every man has a breaking point. He's trying to find mine. And what is yours? Margaret asked softly. Thomas's blue eyes held hers, something unspoken flickering in their depths. I haven't found it yet, but I won't risk your safety to prove my stubbornness. He rose and went to the desk, retrieving a folded document. I've made arrangements for you to travel to Denver, where my sister lives. You'll be safe there until this is resolved. Margaret felt a surprising pang of disappointment. You're sending me away. I'm protecting you. Thomas ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she recognized as frustration. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me. Margaret stood, drawing herself up to her full height, which still left her nearly a foot shorter than Thomas. I came west to build a life for myself, Mr. Quinn, not to run at the first sign of trouble. This is hardly the first sign, Thomas countered. They locked you in a burning barn. And you saved me, she replied, for which I'm grateful. But I won't be chased away from the home I've worked so hard to establish. I won't give them that satisfaction. Thomas studied her with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. You may be the most stubborn woman I've ever encountered. I believe you once called me the bravest, Margaret reminded him, the ghost of a smile touching her lips despite the gravity of their situation. Brave and stubborn often go hand in hand. Thomas sighed, his expression softening. At least stay here for a few days. My ranch is well defended, and it will give us time to consider our options. Margaret knew it was the sensible choice, though something about staying in Thomas's home, being so close to him, made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Very well, she agreed. But only if I can make myself useful. I won't be a burden. You could never be that, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a tone that made her cheeks warm. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the study door. Samuel entered, his expression tense. Riders coming, boss. Looks like the sheriff and Harrington himself. Thomas's expression hardened instantly. How many men? Just the two of them, carrying a white flag. Thomas nodded. Keep the men ready, but no one fires unless I give the order. He turned to Margaret. You should stay inside. No. The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. If this concerns me, I have a right to hear what they have to say. Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him it would be futile. Stay behind me, he finally conceded. And if I tell you to go inside, you do it immediately. No questions. They walked out onto the broad front porch just as the two riders approached the house. Sheriff Wilson was a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache who'd always struck Margaret as more politician than lawman. Beside him rode Victor Harrington, a tall, lean man in his 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and cold eyes that reminded Margaret of a snake. Quinn, Sheriff Wilson called, touching the brim of his hat. Miss Kennedy, glad to see you're safe and sound. No thanks to Mr. Harrington's men, Thomas replied coldly, positioning himself slightly in front of Margaret. Harrington's thin lips curved in what might generously be called a smile. "A terrible misunderstanding, that business yesterday. My boys got overzealous in their protective duties." "Protective duties?" Margaret couldn't contain her disbelief. "They abducted me from town in broad daylight and locked me in a burning building." "Now, Miss Kennedy," Sheriff Wilson said placatingly, "Mr. Harrington has explained the situation. His men spotted some suspicious characters watching you in town. In their haste to get you to safety, they may have been overly forceful. And that fire was an unfortunate accident, a lantern knocked over during the commotion." Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her. "That's absurd," he said flatly. "Your men threatened to burn her alive if I didn't sign over my water rights." Harrington shook his head sorrowfully. "Such imagination, Quinn, always painting me as the villain. I've come here today in front of our good sheriff to apologize for any misunderstanding and to assure Miss Kennedy that she has nothing to fear from me or my men." "How generous," Thomas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose the threatening message left at Miss Kennedy's homestead was also a misunderstanding." A flicker of something surprise perhaps crossed Harrington's face before his mask of civility returned. "I know nothing about any message." "Perhaps you should look closer to home for those responsible, Quinn. You've made more than a few enemies in these parts." Sheriff Wilson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, gentlemen, I'm here to keep the peace. Mr. Harrington has given his word there'll be no more trouble, and I'm inclined to take him at it." "How convenient," Margaret said, stepping forward despite Thomas's protective stance. "Tell me, Sheriff, if I were to file formal charges regarding my kidnapping and attempted murder, would you pursue them with the same vigor you show in accepting Mr. Harrington's transparent lies?" The sheriff reddened, but before he could respond, Harrington laughed a sound entirely devoid of warmth. "Spirited woman you've found yourself, Quinn. I can see why you're so protective." His cold eyes assessed Margaret in a way that made her skin crawl. "A word of advice, Miss Kennedy. The territory is a dangerous place for a woman alone. Accidents happen, tragic ones. It might be wise to consider returning east to civilization." "Is that a threat, Harrington?" Thomas's hand moved to rest on his holstered revolver. "A friendly suggestion only." Harrington tipped his hat. "Good day to you both. Sheriff, shall we? I believe our peacemaking mission is complete." As the two men rode away, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "He's lying," she said quietly. "About all of it." Thomas nodded, his eyes still fixed on the retreating figures. "Of course he is, but he has the sheriff in his pocket and half the territory intimidated into silence." He turned to her, his expression grave. "This changes nothing. You're still in danger, perhaps even more so now that he's seen you here." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I'm not running, Thomas." Something shifted in his eyes at her use of his given name, something warm and surprised. "Then we'll need to be ready," he said softly. "Because Harrington never makes idle threats, and he never gives up what he considers his." As they returned to the house, Margaret was acutely aware of Thomas's hand at the small of her back, a protective gesture that felt strangely natural. Despite the danger that had just ridden away, she felt an odd sense of rightness. For the first time since arriving in Colorado territory, she wasn't facing adversity alone. The realization was both comforting and terrifying, for reasons that had little to do with Victor Harrington's threats. The next few days settled into an uneasy routine. Margaret remained at the Quinn Ranch, where Thomas insisted she would be safer than at her own homestead. Though she'd initially protested being treated like a helpless female, She had to admit the logic of his argument. Her small cabin was isolated and virtually indefensible, while the ranch house was well built and continuously guarded by Thomas's loyal men. To avoid feeling like a burden, Margaret made herself useful around the house, helping Martha with cooking and mending. Thomas had sent men to her homestead to bring back some of her belongings and to make basic repairs to the damage done by Harrington's thugs. The threatening message had been painted over, but its memory lingered like a shadow. On the third day, Thomas found her in the kitchen garden, harvesting vegetables for the evening meal. He paused at the garden gate, watching her for a moment before she noticed him. The sun caught in her auburn hair, creating a halo effect that made his breath catch slightly. "You don't have to do that, you know," he said by way of greeting. Margaret looked up, shielding her eyes with one hand. "I know, but I prefer to earn my keep. You're not a servant here." Thomas entered the garden, kneeling beside her to help gather the ripe tomatoes. "You're a guest, an honored one. A guest who's outstayed her welcome, perhaps." Margaret placed another tomato in her basket. "It's been 3 days with no sign of Harrington or his men." Maybe the sheriff's warning actually took hold. Thomas's expression remained skeptical. "Harrington doesn't give up that easily. He's planning something." His hand brushed hers as they both reached for the same tomato, and Margaret felt a jolt of awareness at the brief contact. "You can't live your life waiting for an attack," she said softly. "I've been doing it for 7 years." Thomas sat back on his heels, studying her face. "But you're right. It's no way to live." He seemed to come to a decision. "Would you ride with me this afternoon?" "There's something I'd like to show you." Curiosity piqued. Margaret nodded. "I'd be delighted. Though I should warn you, I'm not the most accomplished horsewoman." Thomas's smile warmed his eyes. "I happen to have the gentlest mare in the territory, and I'll be right beside you." That afternoon found them riding side by side across the vast expanse of Thomas's ranch. True to his word, the mare he'd provided for Margaret was sweet-tempered and responsive even to her inexperienced commands. The day was perfect clear blue skies, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers, and the majestic Rocky Mountains rising in the distance. "Your land is beautiful," Margaret commented as they crested a hill overlooking a verdant valley with a clear, flowing river cutting through it. "This is what Harrington wants most," Thomas said, gesturing to the water. "This river feeds the entire valley. The water rights are what make my land so valuable and what make me such a thorn in his side." "It seems there should be enough for everyone," Margaret observed, watching the abundant flow. "There is, in years like this. But in drought years, control of the headwaters means the difference between prosperity and ruin. I've always allowed fair water access to neighboring ranchers, but Harrington doesn't want access, he wants control." They continued riding, Thomas pointing out various features of his land with evident pride. Margaret found herself enjoying his company in this relaxed setting, away from the tension of recent events. He was knowledgeable about the land, passionate about his work, and surprisingly funny when he allowed himself to be. Eventually, they reached a small plateau overlooking a particularly stunning vista of mountains, valley, and sky. Thomas dismounted and helped Margaret down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "This is what I wanted to show you," he said, guiding her to the edge of the plateau. "The best view in Colorado Territory, in my humble opinion." Margaret gasped softly as she took in the panorama before her. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the landscape, highlighting the rich tapestry of colors, the deep greens of pine forests, the silver ribbon of the river, the purple-blue shadows of the mountains, and the endless azure sky. "It's breathtaking," she whispered. "This is where I decided to build my ranch," Thomas said, his voice reflective. "I'd been wandering for years after the war, taking odd jobs, drifting from place to place. Then I found this spot and something inside me just settled." He glanced at her. "Do you know what I mean?" Margaret nodded, thinking of how she'd felt when she first saw her own modest homestead. As if you'd found a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing. "Exactly." Thomas looked pleased at her understanding. "I staked my claim the very next day. Built that one-room cabin Martha mentioned with my own hands. Worked from sunup to sundown until I had enough to hire help buy cattle, expand." "You've accomplished so much," Margaret said, genuinely impressed. "You should be proud." Thomas's expression turned thoughtful. "I am. But lately I've been wondering what it's all for. A man builds something like this. He starts thinking about legacy, about what remains when he's gone." There was something in his tone that made Margaret's heart beat a little faster. "You're hardly old enough to be contemplating your mortality, Mr. Quinn." A smile tugged at his lips. "Back to Mr. Quinn, is it? I rather liked hearing you call me Thomas." Margaret felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Thomas, then. Better." His smile widened before turning serious again. "It's not mortality that concerns me so much as purpose. A ranch this size, a house built for a family, it feels empty sometimes." The vulnerability in his admission touched Margaret deeply. "I understand loneliness," she said quietly. "After my father died, I had a house full of things and memories, but it felt hollow. That's partly why I came west, to fill my life with purpose again." "And have you found it? Your purpose?" Margaret considered the question, looking out over the magnificent landscape. "I'm beginning to. My homestead may be small compared to all this, but it's mine. Something I'm building with my own hands, my own vision." She hesitated. "Though I admit, recent events have made me question whether I'm equal to the challenges of life out here." Thomas turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. "You are one of the strongest people I've ever met, Margaret Kennedy. Don't let Harrington make you doubt yourself." His faith in her was like a balm to her uncertain heart. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. "Thank you for saying that, for everything." Something shifted in Thomas's gaze as he looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. The air between them seemed to change, charged with an energy that made it suddenly difficult to breathe. "Margaret," he began, his voice lower than before, "I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, the distant sound of a gunshot shattered the moment. Thomas immediately tensed, his hand going to his sidearm as he scanned the horizon. "That came from the direction of the ranch," he said, his expression hardening. "We need to go. Now." The peaceful interlude was over. As Thomas helped her quickly mount her horse, Margaret couldn't help wondering what he had been about to say. But the concern in his eyes told her it would have to wait. Whatever connection had been building between them was once again overshadowed by the danger that seemed determined to follow them. They rode hard back toward the ranch house, Thomas leading the way with a tension evident in every line of his body. As they drew closer, Margaret could see figures moving rapidly around the buildings, and the acrid smell of smoke reached her nostrils. "Stay behind me," Thomas ordered as they approached the final stretch. The scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. One of the smaller outbuildings was ablaze, ranch hands forming a bucket line from the well to fight the fire. Others stood guard with rifles at the ready, scanning the surrounding landscape for threats. Samuel ran to meet them as they dismounted in the yard. "Riders hit us, boss," he reported grimly. 6 men masked. They threw torches on the stable roof and started shooting when we came out to fight the fire. Got it under control before it spread to the horses, but Johnson took a bullet in the shoulder. Thomas's expression darkened. "Harrington's men. Can't say for certain, but who else would it be?" Samuel glanced at Margaret. "They were calling for the lady, said they had a message for her." Margaret felt cold despite the heat from the nearby fire. "What message?" Samuel looked uncomfortable. "Better come see for yourself, madam. They left something nailed to the main house door before they rode off." Thomas placed a protective hand at Margaret's back as they hurried to the front of the house. Nailed to the heavy wooden door was a piece of paper. Written in what appeared to be dried blood were the words, "A woman alone burns easily. Next time Quinn won't reach you in time." Margaret felt her knees weaken slightly at the explicit threat, but she forced herself to remain standing tall. Thomas ripped the paper from the door, his face a mask of controlled fury. "That settles it," he said in a voice like steel. "You're leaving for Denver tomorrow." "Thomas," Margaret began to protest. "This isn't a debate," he cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "They're escalating, Margaret. Next time it won't be an outbuilding they torch." His eyes met hers, and beneath the anger, she could see genuine fear not for himself, but for her. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." The raw emotion in his voice silenced her objections. For the first time, Margaret fully comprehended the danger she was in and, by extension, the danger she was bringing to Thomas and his people. "Very well," she agreed quietly. "I'll go to Denver, but only temporarily. I won't abandon my homestead forever." Relief visibly washed over Thomas's features. "Thank you." He turned to Samuel. "Double the guards tonight. No one sleeps until we're certain they're not coming back. And send someone for the doctor to tend to Johnson." As Thomas continued giving orders to secure the ranch, Margaret stood silently, watching him in his element, decisive, commanding, respected by his men. It struck her that in the short time she'd known him, he'd become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. That evening, after the fire was extinguished and the wounded ranch hand tended to, Margaret found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The events of the day kept replaying in her mind: the peaceful ride, the moment of connection with Thomas on the plateau, the violent interruption, the blood-written threat. She paced her room restlessly before finally deciding that a cup of tea might help calm her nerves. Wrapping a shawl around her nightgown, she quietly made her way downstairs to the kitchen. To her surprise, she found Thomas already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him. He looked up at her entrance, and she could see the weariness etched in every line of his face. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice slightly rough. Margaret shook her head. "I was going to make some tea. Would you like some?" A small smile touched his lips. "I think I'm past the point where tea would help, but thank you." She busied herself with the kettle and tea leaves, acutely aware of his presence behind her. When she turned back, cup in hand, she found him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "May I join you?" she asked, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Please." Thomas pushed the whiskey bottle aside. "I'm sorry about today. I had hoped to show you the beauty of this place, not remind you of its dangers." "Don't apologize," Margaret said, settling across from him. "The time we spent riding was lovely. I won't let Harrington's threats overshadow that." Thomas studied her face in the low lamplight. "You're remarkable, you know that. Most women would be hysterical after everything you've endured." Margaret sipped her tea. "Perhaps I'm not like most women." "No," Thomas agreed softly. "You certainly are not." He hesitated, then reached across the table to touch her hand. "Before we were interrupted today, I was about to tell you something." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Yes." Thomas's fingers traced a gentle pattern on the back of her hand. "I was going to tell you that meeting you has changed things for me, made me see possibilities I'd stopped looking for." The simple statement, delivered in his deep, sincere voice, sent a wave of warmth through Margaret's entire being. "What kind of possibilities?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. Thomas's blue eyes held hers. "The kind that make a house feel like a home, the kind that give purpose to all this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the ranch beyond the kitchen walls. "I know the timing is terrible with everything that's happening, but I couldn't let you leave tomorrow without telling you that I—" A sudden crash from outside interrupted him for the second time that day. They both jumped to their feet as shouts erupted from the yard. "Stay here," Thomas ordered, grabbing his revolver from the table and moving swiftly toward the door. But before he reached it, the kitchen window shattered inward and a flaming torch landed on the wooden floor. Margaret screamed as flames immediately began to lick at the dry boards. Thomas grabbed a nearby blanket and smothered the torch, but not before the fire had begun to spread to the curtains. "We need to get out," he shouted, grabbing Margaret's arm. "The back door." They rushed toward the rear of the house, but as Thomas pulled open the door, gunfire erupted from the darkness. He slammed it shut just as bullets splintered the wood. "They've surrounded us," he said grimly. "Front door is our only chance." The smoke was already thickening as they made their way through the house. Outside, Margaret could hear shouting and more gunfire, Thomas's men engaging the attackers. When they reached the main hall, they found the front entrance blocked by flames that had clearly been set from outside. "Upstairs," Thomas decided, pulling her toward the staircase. "We can use the balcony to reach the roof of the porch, then jump down." They raced up the stairs as the fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by the dry wood of the old house. Margaret's lungs burned with each breath, and she clutched Thomas's hand like a lifeline. They reached her bedroom, and Thomas threw open the balcony doors. "The roof is just below," he said, assessing the drop. "I'll go first, then help you down." Before Margaret could respond, a massive crash sounded from downstairs, followed by an ominous creaking. Thomas's face paled. "The staircase just collapsed. We need to move now." He climbed over the balcony railing and dropped the short distance to the porch roof. "Come on," he called up to her, arms outstretched. "I'll catch you." Margaret hesitated only briefly before climbing over the railing. Smoke billowed around her as she let herself drop into Thomas's waiting arms. The impact sent them both stumbling, but he managed to keep them upright on the slanted roof. "The edge is just here," Thomas said, guiding her to where they could jump safely to the ground. "It's not far. I'll go first and catch you again." He lowered himself off the edge of the roof, hanging by his fingers for a moment before dropping the remaining few feet to the ground. "Jump," he called up to her. "I'm right here." Margaret gathered her courage and jumped, landing safely in Thomas's arms. He held her close for a brief moment before the reality of their situation reasserted itself. The ranch house was now fully engulfed in flames, lighting the night with its terrible glow. All around them, the sounds of fighting continued. "We need to get to the stables," Thomas said, keeping his body between her and potential danger as they moved through the yard. "If we can reach the horses." A figure suddenly loomed before them, and Margaret gasped in fear before recognizing Samuel, his face streaked with soot and blood. "Boss, thank God you're alive." The foreman's relief was palpable. "We've driven most of them off, but there's still a few holding the path to the stables." "How many men have we lost?" Thomas asked grimly. "None dead, thank the Lord, but several wounded. They hit us hard and fast." Samuel's expression darkened. "It's Harrington's men, right enough. I recognized Blackwell despite his mask." Thomas nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. "Get the wounded to safety. I'm taking Miss Kennedy out of here." "The main road will be watched," Samuel warned. "We won't take the main road." Thomas's eyes reflected the flames of his burning home. "I know these hills better than anyone. We'll head west through the high pass." Margaret looked back at the house, the beautiful home Thomas had built with such care, now being consumed by fire. "Thomas, your ranch." His expression was pained but resolute. "Buildings can be rebuilt. Lives can't be replaced." He took her hand. "Come on, we need to move before they regroup." With Samuel providing covering fire, they made their way to the stables, which had thankfully been saved from the flames. Thomas quickly saddled his stallion, Russet. "We'll have to ride double," he explained as he helped Margaret mount. "The other horses are too spooked by the fire to be reliable." He swung up behind her, one arm circling her waist to hold her securely against him. "Hold tight to the saddle horn," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear. "This ride won't be gentle." As they burst from the stable into the night, shots rang out from the darkness. Thomas leaned low over Margaret, shielding her with his body as he urged Russet to a full gallop. They raced across the ranch yard and into the shadows beyond, leaving behind the burning house and the sounds of conflict. Margaret clung to the saddle, her heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's hooves. The night air stung her smoke-irritated eyes, bringing tears that the wind whipped away. Behind her, Thomas's solid presence was her only comfort in the chaos, the one constant in a world suddenly turned upside down. They rode hard for what seemed like hours, climbing steadily into the foothills. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, forcing Thomas to slow their pace. Finally, in a small, sheltered canyon with a trickling stream, he drew Russet to a halt. "We'll rest here briefly," he said, dismounting and helping Margaret down. Her legs trembled beneath her, partly from the extended ride and partly from delayed shock. Thomas steadied her with gentle hands. "Are you hurt anywhere?" he asked, his eyes searching her face with concern. Margaret shook her head, though every muscle in her body ached. "Just tired and worried about your men. Samuel will take care of them. He knows to lead any survivors to our fallback location." Thomas led Russet to the stream to drink. "We'll meet them there tomorrow. Where are we going now?" "There's an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles further into the mountains. We can shelter there until it's safe to move on." Thomas untied his bedroll from behind the saddle. "We'll rest for an hour, then continue. It's not safe to stay in one place too long." Margaret sank down on a boulder, the enormity of what had happened finally hitting her full force. "This is all because of me," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Your home, your ranch, your men hurt. All because Harrington thinks I mean something to you." Thomas knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "Listen to me, Margaret. None of this is your fault. Harrington has been looking for an excuse to destroy me for years. If not this, he would have found another reason." His fingers tightened around hers. "And you do mean something to me. More than I realized until I saw you in danger." The simple admission, spoken in the darkness of this wilderness sanctuary, broke something open inside Margaret. The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, and a sob escaped her lips. Thomas gathered her into his arms, holding her against his chest as she wept. His hand stroked her hair soothingly, his heartbeat steady under her ear. "I'm sorry," she managed between sobs. "I don't usually." "Don't apologize," he murmured. "You've been stronger than anyone could reasonably expect. Even the strongest person needs to bend sometimes." Gradually, her tears subsided, but Thomas continued to hold her, as if reluctant to break the connection between them. Margaret became acutely aware of his warmth, the solid strength of his arms around her, the subtle scent of smoke, leather, and something distinctly him. "Thomas," she said softly, lifting her head to look at him. His eyes, dark in the moonlight, met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes, in the kitchen before we were interrupted. What were you going to say to me?" Thomas's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away a lingering tear. "I was going to tell you that I think I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Kennedy." The words hung in the night air between them, profound in their simplicity. Margaret's heart seemed to stop, then restart with a rush that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "Oh," she breathed, unable to formulate a more eloquent response. A small, uncertain smile touched Thomas's lips. "Is that all you have to say?" Margaret placed her hand over his where it still rested against her cheek. "I think perhaps I'm falling in love with you too, Thomas Quinn." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then blindingly beautiful. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward until his lips were a breath away from hers. "May I?" he whispered. In answer, Margaret closed the distance between them. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, the kiss tender at first, then deepening as she responded with a fervor that surprised them both. His arms tightened around her, drawing her closer as years of loneliness seemed to dissolve in the connection between them. When they finally parted, both breathing unevenly, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I pulled you from that burning barn," he admitted. Margaret smiled, her heart lighter despite their precarious situation. "I believe I've wanted you to since that same moment." For a brief, suspended time, they simply held each other in the moonlight, finding solace and strength in their newfound connection. But reality couldn't be held at bay forever. Thomas eventually pulled back with obvious reluctance. "We should move on," he said, his voice regretful. "It's not safe to linger." Margaret nodded, though she was loath to break the spell of intimacy that had enveloped them. As Thomas helped her back onto Russet, his touch lingered, conveying without words that what had passed between them was real and precious. They continued their journey through the night, climbing higher into the mountains. Margaret leaned back against Thomas's chest, drawing comfort from his presence despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. Whatever came next, they would face it together, a realization that filled her with a courage she hadn't known she possessed. The old trapper's cabin appeared just before dawn, a small, sturdy structure nestled in a grove of pine trees. It was primitive but sound, with a stone fireplace and a single room containing a rough-hewn bed and table. "It's not much," Thomas said as he helped Margaret dismount, "but it's defensible and hidden. We'll be safe here for a day or two." While Thomas tended to Russet and gathered firewood, Margaret explored the cabin. Despite its rustic nature, it was clean and well-maintained. Someone Thomas, she presumed, had stocked it with basic provisions: dried beans, coffee, jerky, and several blankets. By the time Thomas returned with an armload of wood, Margaret had swept the dirt floor and was examining the fireplace. "You don't have to do that," Thomas said, setting down the wood. "You must be exhausted." "Keeping busy helps me not to worry," Margaret admitted. "And I meant what I said about earning my keep." Thomas's expression softened as he built a fire. "You've nothing to prove, Margaret, not to me." As the flames caught and began to warm the chilly cabin, Thomas unwrapped a bundle from his saddlebag, revealing bread, cheese, and dried apples, provisions he'd grabbed during their hasty escape. They ate in comfortable silence, both too tired for extensive conversation. When they'd finished, Thomas stood and stretched his tall frame. "You should take the bed," he said, nodding toward the simple frame with its straw mattress. "I'll keep watch by the door." Margaret looked at the narrow bed, then back at Thomas. "You need rest as much as I do. We could share it." A blush heated her cheeks at the boldness of her suggestion. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "Margaret, I wouldn't presume. For sleep only," she clarified quickly. "It seems foolish for one of us to be uncomfortable when we're both exhausted." After a moment's hesitation, Thomas nodded. "If you're certain." They arranged themselves on the narrow bed, both still fully clothed, with Thomas's revolver within easy reach. Despite her exhaustion, Margaret found herself acutely aware of Thomas beside her, the heat of his body warming her through the blanket they shared. "Try to sleep," he murmured, sensing her wakefulness. "I'll hear if anyone approaches." Margaret turned onto her side, facing him in the dim light of the dying fire. "What happens now, Thomas, after we leave here?" His expression was thoughtful as he considered her question. "We'll meet up with Samuel and any others who escaped at our rendezvous point. Then we'll need to reach the territorial authorities, not the local sheriff, but the federal marshal. With enough witnesses to what Harrington has done, we might finally see justice. And if we don't?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Then I rebuild, start over. I won't let him win." "We rebuild," Margaret corrected softly, "if you'll have my help." Thomas's hand found hers under the blanket, his fingers intertwining with hers. "There's nothing I want more," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But Margaret, you should know my life has never been easy. The path ahead will be difficult, dangerous perhaps." "I didn't come west looking for an easy life," she reminded him. "I came looking for meaning, for purpose." Her fingers tightened around his. "I think perhaps I've found it." The smile that spread across Thomas's face was worth every hardship she'd endured. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sleep now," he whispered. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling safer than she had any right to given their circumstances. As sleep claimed her, her last conscious thought was that home might not be a place at all, but a person who made you feel anchored in a world of uncertainty. They slept through most of the day, bodies and minds demanding rest after the ordeal they'd survived. When Margaret awakened, the cabin was filled with the golden light of late afternoon, and Thomas was no longer beside her. For a moment, panic seized her before she heard movement outside. She rose and went to the small window, relief washing over her at the sight of Thomas chopping wood near the cabin. He'd removed his shirt in the afternoon heat, and Margaret found herself watching the play of muscles across his back and shoulders as he worked. A warmth that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature spread through her. When Thomas returned inside, he seemed pleased to find her awake. "I was beginning to worry," he said, setting down the wood he'd carried in. "You've been sleeping soundly for hours." "I needed it," Margaret admitted. "As did you, I'm sure." Thomas nodded, running a hand through his dark hair. "I feel almost human again. Hungry." They shared a simple meal of the provisions Thomas had packed, supplemented with fresh berries he'd found growing nearby. As they ate, they discussed their plans for the following day, the route to the rendezvous point, what they might expect to find there, how they would proceed once reunited with Thomas's men. "It's about a half-day's ride to meet Samuel," Thomas explained. "From there, another day to reach the territorial marshal's office in Riverside." "Do you trust the marshal?" Margaret asked, remembering the sheriff's obvious allegiance to Harrington. "Marshal Dawson is a good man, incorruptible. If anyone can bring Harrington to justice, it's him." Thomas hesitated. "But Margaret, there's something else we need to discuss, something I've been thinking about." The seriousness in his tone made her sit up straighter. "What is it?" Thomas met her gaze directly. "I meant what I said last night about my feelings for you, but the timing. It's not what I would have chosen. Everything has happened so quickly and under such extreme circumstances." Margaret felt a chill of apprehension. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," he said quickly, reaching across to take her hand. "Not at all, but I want you to have them if you need to." When people face danger together, emotions can become intensified. What feels right in a moment of crisis might look different in the clear light of day. His consideration touched her deeply. "Are you suggesting that what I feel for you is merely a reaction to our circumstances?" "I'm suggesting that you deserve the chance to be certain," Thomas clarified. "Without pressure, without danger clouding your judgment." Margaret studied his face, the strong lines of his jaw, the sincerity in his blue eyes, the genuine concern written in his expression. This was a man who would put her well-being above his own desires, who would offer her freedom even if it meant losing her. "Thomas Quinn," she said finally, her voice steady, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. What I feel for you began before the danger that day. You first rode to my homestead to welcome me to the territory, with that ridiculously large basket of provisions and advice about surviving the winter." A smile tugged at his lips at the memory. "You were so politely determined to do everything yourself. I remember thinking you were either the bravest or the most stubborn woman I'd ever met." "Both, perhaps," Margaret admitted with a small laugh. "The point is, this isn't just about shared danger or gratitude for your rescues, though I am eternally grateful. This is about who you are, your kindness, your integrity, your strength." She squeezed his hand. "I don't need more time to know my own heart." The relief that washed over Thomas's face was almost palpable. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then, when this is over, when Harrington is brought to justice, and we're both safe, would you do me the honor of considering a more permanent arrangement between us?" Margaret's heart soared at the implication. "Are you proposing, Mr. Quinn?" "Not officially," he clarified with a smile. "When I properly propose, there will be a ring and considerably less dirt on both of us. Consider this a declaration of intent." "Then I accept your declaration," Margaret replied, her own smile blooming, "and look forward to your proper proposal with great anticipation." The evening passed in conversation that ranged from serious plans for the future to shared stories of their pasts. Margaret learned about Thomas's experiences in the war, his journey west, and his dreams for his ranch. In turn, she told him about her life in Boston, her unconventional education thanks to a progressive father, and her decision to seek independence in the territory. As night fell, they retired again to the narrow bed, this time with less awkwardness than before. Thomas held her gently in his arms, her head resting on his chest, his heartbeat a steady rhythm under her ear. "We should reach the rendezvous point by midday tomorrow," he murmured into her hair. "Try to rest well. The ride won't be easy." Margaret nodded, already drifting toward sleep, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Dawn broke clear and cool with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. They set out early, Thomas once again helping Margaret onto Russet before mounting behind her. The descent from the mountains was slower than their ascent had been, with Thomas choosing their path carefully to avoid potential ambushes. As they rode, Margaret found herself simultaneously anxious to reunite with Thomas's men and reluctant to end the intimate time they'd shared in the cabin. Something had solidified between them in those quiet hours, a foundation upon which to build a future, if they survived the immediate dangers. Around midday, they approached a small clearing beside a creek, the rendezvous point Thomas had arranged with Samuel. Margaret felt Thomas tense behind her as they neared the location. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "There should be men posted as lookouts." He drew Russet to a halt at the edge of the trees, scanning the clearing with narrowed eyes. "Stay here," he instructed, dismounting and drawing his revolver. "If you hear gunfire, ride back the way we came. Don't wait for me." "Thomas," Margaret began to protest. "Please," he said, his expression grave. "I can't focus if I'm worried about you being in the line of fire." Reluctantly, Margaret nodded. Thomas squeezed her hand once, then moved silently into the clearing, staying low and using the available cover. From her position, Margaret watched anxiously as Thomas approached the designated meeting spot. Her heart thundered in her chest with each passing moment. When a figure suddenly emerged from the trees on the opposite side, she nearly cried out in alarm before recognizing Samuel's lanky form. The two men spoke briefly, then motioned for her to join them. Relief flooding through her, Margaret urged Russet forward. "What happened?" she asked as she reached them. "Where are the others?" Samuel's expression was grim. "Ambushed on the way here. Harrington's men were waiting for us about 5 miles back." He gestured to a crude bandage on his upper arm. "Got me and Johnson. Peterson and Young didn't make it." The news of the deaths hit Thomas visibly hard. His jaw tightened and a muscle worked in his cheek. "Where's Johnson now?" "Sent him on to Riverside with Bradley. Figured he needed a doctor and we needed to get word to Marshal Dawson regardless." Samuel glanced between Thomas and Margaret. "What's the plan now, boss?" Thomas was silent for a moment, clearly weighing their options. "We follow them to Riverside. The three of us together have a better chance than splitting up, especially if Harrington's men are still in these hills." They set off immediately, with Samuel riding ahead as scout while Thomas and Margaret followed on Russet. The mood was somber, the weight of the lost men heavy on all their hearts. "I'm sorry about your men," Margaret said quietly as they rode. "They died because of me." Thomas's arm tightened around her waist. "They died because of Harrington's greed and cruelty. Don't take that burden on yourself." They traveled through the afternoon and into the evening, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses. As night fell, they made a cold camp in a sheltered ravine, foregoing a fire that might attract attention. "We should reach Riverside by midday tomorrow," Thomas said as they shared the last of their provisions, "assuming we don't encounter any more of Harrington's men." Samuel, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "There's something you should know, boss. Something I heard before the ambush." He hesitated, glancing at Margaret. "Harrington's put a price on both your heads. $500 for Miss Kennedy alive. 1,000 for you dead or alive." Margaret gasped softly at the sum. Thomas's expression hardened. "He's desperate," he observed. "Means we're a genuine threat to him now. Means every bounty hunter and hired gun in the territory will be looking for you," Samuel corrected grimly. They took turns keeping watch through the night, though Margaret suspected neither Thomas nor Samuel slept much during their off hours. She herself dozed fitfully, haunted by dreams of fire and pursuing shadows. They set out again at first light, pushing their tired horses as hard as they dared. The terrain gradually changed from forested hills to more open country as they approached Riverside. Margaret felt increasingly exposed as the tree cover thinned, imagining eyes watching them from every rise and hollow. It was mid-morning when Samuel, riding slightly ahead, suddenly raised his hand in warning. They halted immediately, and Thomas's arm instinctively tightened around Margaret. "Riders," Samuel said quietly, pointing to a dust cloud visible in the distance. "Coming fast from the direction of Riverside." Thomas frowned, studying the approaching group. "Too many to be Harrington's men alone. Could be a posse. Or the marshal," Margaret suggested hopefully. They waited tensely as the riders drew nearer. Eventually, Thomas relaxed slightly. "It's Dawson," he confirmed, recognizing the lead rider, "and Johnson with him. Looks like they got our message." The approaching group numbered about 15 men, led by a square-jawed individual with a silver star pinned to his vest. Marshal Dawson reined in his horse as he reached them, his weathered face breaking into a relieved smile. "Quinn, Miss Kennedy, thank the Lord you're both alive." He dismounted, approaching them with outstretched hand. Your man Johnson reached us yesterday with quite a tale. Wasn't sure I'd find you in one piece." Thomas clasped the offered hand firmly. "It's good to see you, Jack. We've had a hell of a time getting here." "So I gathered." Dawson's expression turned serious. "Got the whole story from Johnson and your other man. Kidnapping, attempted murder, arson. Harrington's finally gone too far." He glanced at Margaret. "Madam, I'll need your full account as well, but first, let's get you both to town. You look like you could use a hot meal and a safe bed." As they rode into Riverside flanked by the marshal's men, Margaret felt the weight of constant vigilance begin to lift from her shoulders. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to truly believe they might survive this ordeal. The marshal installed them in rooms above the town's most reputable hotel, with armed deputies posted in the hallway and at all entrances. After the luxury of a proper bath and clean clothes, hastily purchased by one of the deputies, Margaret joined Thomas and Marshal Dawson in a private dining room to give their formal statements. For over 2 hours, they recounted the entire sequence of events: Margaret's kidnapping, Thomas's rescue, the threats, the attack on the ranch, their flight into the mountains, and the ambush that had killed 2 of Thomas's men. The marshal took detailed notes, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This is more than enough for an arrest warrant," he said when they'd finished. "I'll ride out tonight with a posse to apprehend Harrington and his men." "He won't go quietly," Thomas warned. Dawson nodded grimly. "I'm counting on that. Frankly, Quinn, after what he's done, I'd almost prefer he resist." He gathered his notes and stood. "You two stay put. This hotel is the safest place in town until we've got Harrington in custody." After the marshal left, Margaret and Thomas sat in silence for a moment, the reality of all they'd been through settling over them. "It's strange," Margaret said finally, "to be sitting in a civilized dining room after everything that's happened. It feels unreal somehow." Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. "I know what you mean. Part of me is still back in those mountains, expecting an attack at any moment." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "But it's almost over now. Dawson will bring Harrington to justice. And then?" Margaret asked, her heart quickening at the look in his eyes. "And then," Thomas said softly, "we rebuild, together." The word hung between them, filled with promise. Despite their exhaustion, despite the dangers not yet fully past, Margaret felt a surge of hope for the future, a future with this man who had risked everything to save her, whose strength and gentleness had captured her heart amid fire and chaos. They retired to their separate rooms that evening, propriety maintained despite their shared experiences of recent days. Margaret found it difficult to sleep in the too-soft bed, missing the solid warmth of Thomas beside her. Eventually, she drifted into a restless slumber, only to be awakened by a soft knock at her door in the pre-dawn hours. "Who is it?" she called quietly, instantly alert. "It's me," Thomas's voice replied. "May I come in? There's news." Margaret hastily donned a robe over her nightgown and opened the door. Thomas stood in the hallway, fully dressed despite the early hour, his expression tense. "What's happened?" she asked as she let him in, noting the deputy still standing watch at the end of the hall. "Dawson's back," Thomas said, his voice low. "The raid didn't go as planned. Harrington was waiting for them, had his entire operation packed up and men positioned for an ambush. There was a firefight." Fear clutched at Margaret's heart. "The marshal, wounded, but he'll live." 2 of his deputies weren't so fortunate. Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Harrington escaped with his closest men. The rest were either killed or captured." "So he's still out there," Margaret whispered, her momentary sense of safety evaporating. Thomas nodded grimly. "Dawson believes he's headed for the border. He's organizing another posse to pursue him. He hesitated. He wants me to go with them, says I know Harrington's habits better than anyone. Margaret felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. The thought of Thomas riding out to face Harrington, potentially walking into another ambush, was unbearable. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice barely audible. "We could leave. Start over somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't find us." Thomas's expression softened as he reached out to cup her cheek. "Is that what you want, to run?" Margaret leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "No," she admitted. "Not really. I'm just afraid of losing you when I've only just found you." "You won't lose me," Thomas promised, drawing her into his arms. "But Harrington needs to be stopped. Not just for us, but for everyone in this territory. For the men we've already lost." Margaret nodded against his chest, knowing he was right despite the fear gripping her heart. "When do you leave?" "Within the hour. Dawson doesn't want to give Harrington any more of a head start." Thomas pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "You'll be safe here. The deputies will guard you until I return." "I know." Margaret summoned a brave smile. "Go, do what you need to do." "I'll be waiting." Thomas's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, seeking permission. When she nodded slightly, he lowered his head and kissed her, not the gentle, exploratory kisses they'd shared before, but something deeper, more urgent, carrying the weight of words unsaid and fears unvoiced. When they finally parted, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I will come back to you," he vowed. "Nothing on this earth could keep me away." Margaret clung to that promise in the days that followed. The posse departed Riverside at dawn, leaving her under the protection of the remaining deputies. Hours stretched into days with no word of their progress or Harrington's whereabouts. To keep from going mad with worry, Margaret threw herself into helping care for the wounded marshal and deputies. Her childhood nursing skills, learned at her father's side during his medical practice, proved valuable. Marshal Dawson, confined to his bed by a bullet wound to his leg, became a reluctant but grateful patient. "Quinn's a good man," the marshal told her on the third day as she changed his bandages. "One of the best I've known in these parts. Been worried about him these past years, living out there alone with nothing but his work." Margaret smiled slightly. "He's not a man who reveals his feelings easily." "No," Dawson agreed with a knowing look. "But when he does, you can take it to the bank. Never known him to say anything he didn't mean with his whole heart." The marshal's words were a comfort during the long hours of waiting. As were Martha's letters, delivered by a deputy who'd ridden out to check on the ranch. The housekeeper had survived the attack and was already organizing efforts to salvage what could be saved from the burned-out shell of the main house. Several of Thomas's men had returned to help, determined that Harrington wouldn't succeed in destroying everything their boss had built. It was nearly a week after Thomas's departure when the lookout posted at the edge of town spotted riders approaching. Margaret, who had been helping in the small infirmary, heard the commotion and rushed outside, her heart in her throat. Through a cloud of dust, she could make out a group of about 10 men riding slowly toward town. At their head was a figure she recognized immediately: Thomas, sitting tall in the saddle despite obvious exhaustion. Relief flooded through her with such force that her knees nearly buckled. As the riders drew closer, she could see that several were wounded. Behind them, additional horses carried what appeared to be bodies wrapped in blankets, but her eyes remained fixed on Thomas, searching for any sign of injury. The group reached the main street, and Thomas spotted her immediately. Something in his expression, a mixture of weariness and profound relief, told her everything she needed to know even before he dismounted and strode toward her. "It's over," he said simply as he reached her. "Harrington's dead." Margaret searched his face, seeing the toll the pursuit had taken. "And you, are you hurt?" A small, tired smile touched his lips. "Nothing that won't heal." He glanced back at the somber procession. "We lost 2 good men bringing him to justice, and Johnson's badly wounded. He needs a doctor right away." They helped the injured into the infirmary, where Margaret assisted the town doctor in treating them. Thomas refused treatment for himself until all his men were seen to, insisting his own injuries, a shallow bullet graze on his arm, and various cuts and bruises were insignificant compared to the others. It was late evening before they had a moment alone together. Thomas had given his report to the recovering Marshal Dawson, overseen the proper care of his wounded men, and arranged for the transportation of the dead back to their families. The weight of responsibility showed in every line of his body as he finally sat beside Margaret on a bench outside the hotel. "Tell me what happened," she said quietly, taking his hand between both of hers. Thomas was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "We tracked them to an abandoned mining camp near the border. Harrington had maybe 15 men left with him, the hardest, most loyal of his gang. They spotted us coming and set up an ambush in the hills." His jaw tightened at the memory. "We lost Carter in that first exchange. Good man. Young." Margaret squeezed his hand encouragingly, knowing he needed to unburden himself. "We pulled back, surrounded the camp, waited them out for 2 days." Thomas's voice was flat, recounting the facts without emotion. "On the 3rd morning, they tried to break through our lines. That's when Johnson was hit, and Evans." He fell silent again, his gaze distant. Margaret waited patiently, offering silent support through her touch. "I was the one who got Harrington," Thomas finally continued. "He recognized me, even tried to bargain at the end. Offered me twice what my ranch was worth if I'd let him go." A grim smile touched his lips. "I told him my ranch wasn't for sale, neither was justice for the men he'd killed. Did he? Did you?" Margaret couldn't quite form the question. Thomas understood nevertheless. "He drew on me. I had no choice." His eyes met hers, searching for judgment or revulsion. "I've never killed a man outside of war before, Margaret, even knowing what he'd done, what he would have done to you. It sits heavy." Margaret raised a hand to his cheek, her touch gentle. "That's because you're a good man, Thomas Quinn. The fact that it troubles you proves that." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. "All I could think about, even in that moment, was getting back to you, making sure you were safe." He opened his eyes, his gaze intent. "I meant what I said before I left. Nothing could have kept me from returning to you." Margaret's heart swelled with emotion. Despite the exhaustion and sorrow etched in his features, Thomas had never looked more handsome to her than in this moment of vulnerability and honesty. "I love you," she said simply, the words falling from her lips with natural ease. "I think perhaps I have since you rode through fire to save me." Thomas's expression transformed, weariness giving way to a joy that took her breath away. "I love you too, Margaret Kennedy. More than I thought possible." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I had intended a more romantic setting for this, but I find I can't wait another moment." Margaret's breath caught as he opened his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small, perfect diamond. "I've been carrying this since Dawson sent me to Denver for supplies 3 months ago," Thomas admitted. "Saw it in a jeweler's window and thought of you, though I had no right to at the time." He took her hand, his expression solemn. "Margaret Kennedy, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me, whatever challenges that might entail?" Tears of joy filled Margaret's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise to each other, a promise born in fire and danger, but destined to flourish in the peace they had fought so hard to secure. They were married 2 weeks later in Riverside's small church. Marshall Dawson, still using crutches but determined to stand as Thomas's best man, beamed with almost paternal pride throughout the ceremony. Martha, who had traveled from the ranch for the occasion, dabbed tears from her eyes as Margaret and Thomas exchanged their vows. "I take you as my husband," Margaret said, her voice clear and strong, "to love and cherish through all the days of our lives. Whatever challenges come, we will face them together." "I take you as my wife," Thomas responded, his blue eyes never leaving hers, "to protect and honor for all our days. My heart, my home, my life, they are yours, now and always." The rebuilding of the Quinn Ranch began immediately after their honeymoon, a week spent in the trapper's cabin that had sheltered them during their flight from danger. What had been a place of refuge now became a sanctuary of a different kind, where they explored their new relationship away from the demands of the world. Upon their return, they found that Martha and the ranch hands had already made significant progress. The burned-out shell of the main house had been cleared away, and new foundation stones were being laid. Margaret threw herself into the planning of their new home with enthusiasm, working alongside Thomas to create something that would reflect both their tastes and dreams. "It will be even better than before," Thomas said as they stood surveying the construction one golden autumn afternoon. "Stronger, built for the future we'll share." Margaret leaned against his side, his arm automatically circling her waist. "Our children will grow up here," she said softly. "Learn to ride in these fields, swim in that river." Thomas's arm tightened around her. "Children?" he asked, a note of wonder in his voice. Margaret smiled up at him, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat stomach. "Sooner than we might have planned," she admitted. "But I think he or she will be welcomed nonetheless." The joy that spread across Thomas's face was answer enough, even before he swept her into his arms and spun her in a circle, laughing with pure delight. "Careful," Margaret protested through her own laughter. "I'm in a delicate condition, remember." Thomas immediately set her down, his expression comically shifting to concern. "I'm sorry, are you all right? Should you be resting?" Martha said. Margaret silenced him with a kiss. "I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. I won't break." Thomas's hand remained protectively over her abdomen, his expression filled with awe. "A child," he murmured. "Our child." In that moment, watching the man she loved absorb the news of their growing family, Margaret felt a contentment so profound, it nearly brought tears to her eyes. The journey that had brought them to this point had been fraught with danger and loss, but it had led to something beautiful, a love forged in fire, tested by adversity, and now blossoming into a future filled with promise. As the sun began to set over the land they both loved, Margaret Kennedy Quinn stood in the circle of her husband's arms, grateful for the twists of fate that had brought her west, into danger, and ultimately into the greatest happiness she had ever known. From the ashes of destruction, they were building something lasting together, a home, a family, a legacy. And when their daughter was born the following spring, a strong, healthy girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair, they named her Phoenix, a constant reminder that from the flames of adversity, new life and hope could rise. Years passed, and the Quinn Ranch flourished under their joint stewardship. Thomas's progressive ranching methods and Margaret's sharp business acumen transformed what had already been a successful operation into one of the most prosperous in the territory. The new main house, larger and more beautiful than its predecessor, became known for its hospitality and warmth. Phoenix was joined by two brothers in subsequent years, Thomas Jr. And William and the sound of children's laughter became as much a part of the ranch as the lowing of cattle and the rhythm of seasonal work. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Thomas surprised Margaret by taking her to the plateau that had once been their special place, the spot where he had first begun to tell her of his feelings before being interrupted by Harrington's attack. "You remember the last time we were here?" he asked as they stood looking out over the vast landscape that was now unquestionably their home. Margaret smiled, leaning back against his chest as his arms encircled her from behind. "Of course. You were about to make a declaration before we were so rudely interrupted." Thomas chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her back. "I was terrified that day, not of Harrington, but of telling you how I felt, afraid you wouldn't feel the same or that it was too soon. And now—" Margaret turned in his arms to face him, noting the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples, the laugh lines deepening around his eyes. To her, he was more handsome than ever. "Now," Thomas said, his voice deep with emotion, "I thank God every day for bringing you into my life, for the family we've created, the home we've built." He kissed her gently. "For the woman who was brave enough to face fire and danger rather than abandon what she believed in." Margaret's hand came up to caress his cheek, her wedding ring catching the sunlight. "I thank God for sending a cowboy brave enough to ride through smoke and flames to carry me out," she replied softly. "And wise enough to know that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the greatest dangers." As they rode home together, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From a woman locked in a burning barn to the mistress of a thriving ranch, wife to a man she adored, and mother to 3 beautiful children, it was a path she could never have imagined when she first set out west in search of independence. What she had found instead was so much more valuable. Not just independence, but interdependence. Not just a homestead, but a true home. Not just a life built by her own hands, but one shared with a partner who valued her strength as much as she valued his. And it had all begun with fire, destructive, terrifying but ultimately purifying, burning away everything but what was most essential: love, courage, and the determination to build something lasting from the ashes of what had been lost. As the Quinn Ranch came into view, with Phoenix and her brothers running out to meet them, waving excitedly, Margaret exchanged a look of perfect understanding with the man who had once ridden through flames to save her life, only to end up saving her heart as well. Some fires destroyed, but others, Margaret knew, forged bonds that would last a lifetime,